What if the greatest machine ever built by human hands nearly destroyed the company that created it? What if $25 billion, 5 countries, 4 million parts, and 2 decades of obsessive engineering ambition all collapsed because of a software version mismatch? What if the most beloved passenger aircraft in history, the one that gave you a shower at 40,000 feet and a bar in the sky, was also the single biggest financial miscalculation in the history of commercial aviation? A massive white double-deck aircraft descends silently through gray clouds over London, its shadow stretching across the rooftops below. 4 engines barely audible despite its 575-ton frame. This is the Airbus A380, and this is the story of how one company looked at the future, bet everything on it, and watched the future walk away. It is August 2008 at London Heathrow, and hundreds of people are pressed against the perimeter fence on the northern edge of the airport, cameras raised, completely silent, staring at the sky. They are not aviation professionals. They are not airline executives. They are just people who heard something extraordinary was coming. A vast white shape emerges from the low cloud on final approach to runway 27 left. 2 full decks of windows, 4 engines, a wingspan wider than the Wright brothers' entire first flight, and as it passes overhead, the ground trembles slightly, and the crowd erupts in the kind of spontaneous, disbelieving AWE that you cannot manufacture and cannot fake. That moment is where this story begins. But to understand why it ended the way it did, we have to go back to the year 2000, to a crisis that was quietly strangling the entire global aviation industry from the inside. Picture the world's busiest airports at the turn of the millennium. Aerial views of aircraft stacked in holding patterns above gray cities, nose to tail on taxiways, gates packed with delayed passengers staring at departure boards. London Heathrow was handling over 460,000 flights a year, its theoretical maximum. There was no room for a single additional departure slot. JFK was the same. Tokyo Narita had been fighting a political and legal battle over a third runway for 30 years and losing. The aviation industry was growing at 4% a year, passenger numbers climbing, demand accelerating, but the infrastructure, the runways, the gates, the airspace could not keep up. You cannot build a new runway at Heathrow in 5 years. You cannot add airspace over Tokyo. The physical world has limits. So the question became, if you cannot add more flights, how do you move more people? The answer seemed obvious. You put more people on each flight. And one company decided to take that answer to its absolute extreme. 2 of the most powerful aerospace companies on Earth looked at the same problem in the year 2000. They reached completely opposite conclusions. A massive white double-deck A380 on one side of the sky, a sleek carbon gray 787 Dreamliner on the other, both in flight, both representing a fundamentally different theory of how the future would work. Airbus looked at the congested hubs and saw the future as bigger. Concentrate passengers. Fly them in massive numbers between the world's great hub airports. Heathrow to Dubai, Dubai to Singapore, Singapore to Sydney. Mega hubs connected by mega planes. Boeing looked at the same congested hubs and saw the future as smaller. Bypass the hubs entirely. Fly passengers directly from secondary cities to secondary cities. Manchester to Boston, Osaka to Vancouver, point to point. No connections, no congestion. Smaller, more efficient twin-engine jets opening routes that had never existed before. Airbus built the A380. Boeing built the 787 Dreamliner. One of these companies was reading the future correctly. One of them was about to make the most expensive mistake in commercial aviation history. And in the year 2000, nobody, not the airlines, not the analysts, not the engineers, knew which was which. To understand what Airbus was attempting, you have to understand the scale of what they were actually building. A cutaway diagram of the A380's double-deck fuselage, wider than any commercial aircraft ever constructed, its 2 full passenger decks stretching back nearly 73 meters. 555 passengers in a typical 2-class configuration. 853 in a theoretical all-economy layout, a number that was actually tested, actually certified. 853 human beings evacuated from the aircraft in 78 seconds in a darkened hangar in Hamburg to prove it could be done. The wingspan was almost 80 meters. The tail stood 24 meters high, taller than an 8-story building. The maximum takeoff weight was 575 tons, which means a fully loaded A380 weighs more than the entire space shuttle stack at launch. 4 million individual components sourced from more than 1,500 suppliers across the world. Wings built in Broughton, Wales. Fuselage sections manufactured in Hamburg, Germany, and Saint-Nazaire, France. The tail assembled in Getafe, Spain. All of it transported by sea and road to Toulouse, France for final assembly. A convoy of oversized trucks carrying fuselage sections moving slowly through the streets of a French village at night. The sections so wide they barely fit between the buildings on either side. Airbus had to build an entirely new factory just to assemble the aircraft. They had to widen roads. They had to dredge rivers. They had to reinforce bridges. They had to build new port facilities. The logistics of manufacturing the A380 were almost as ambitious as the aircraft itself, and they had not even started on the money, 11 billion euros. That was Airbus's original development budget when the A380 program was formally launched in December 2000. A graph showing projected costs as a clean straight line, already the largest single investment in commercial aviation history, already a number that made board members lose sleep, and it turned out to be less than half of what the program would actually cost. To finance the A380, Airbus needed launch aid from 4 European governments: France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Spain. It needed bank loans. It needed advance payments from airlines. It needed everything it could get. The program was so large, so expensive, so all-consuming that it effectively crowded out every other major development project at Airbus for nearly a decade. If the A380 succeeded, Airbus would dominate commercial aviation for a generation. If it failed, the consequences were almost too large to contemplate. And then, before a single aircraft had been delivered to a single customer, something went catastrophically wrong inside the production line. The year is 2006, and inside the Airbus production facilities, engineers are attempting to connect the wiring harnesses, the hundreds of kilometers of electrical cables that run through every modern aircraft like a nervous system, and they are discovering something that should have been impossible. Close up, dense bundles of colored electrical cables run through the interior of an unfinished aircraft fuselage, and technicians in white overalls examine connection points with expressions of visible disbelief. The Hamburg factory in Germany and the Saint-Nazaire factory in France had been designing their sections of the aircraft using different versions of the same computer-aided design software. CATIA version 4 in Hamburg, CATIA version 5 in France. The two versions were not fully incompatible. The result was that wiring harnesses designed in Germany were physically incompatible with the connection points manufactured in France, on an aircraft with hundreds of kilometers of wiring across dozens of aircraft already in various stages of production. The fix was not a software patch. The fix was tearing out wiring and redesigning it by hand, aircraft by aircraft, section by section. Airbus announced a 6-month delivery delay in June 2006, then another delay in October 2006, then a third delay in 2007. The total slippage reaching nearly 2 years. The share price of EADS, Airbus's parent company, collapsed by more than 25% in a single day. The chief executive officer resigned. His replacement lasted less than 3 months before he too was gone. The wiring scandal cost Airbus an estimated 4.8 billion euros in penalties, rework costs, and lost revenue. And the aircraft still had not flown. April 27, 2005. And yes, the first flight came before the production crisis, which tells you something about how chaotic this program really was. Toulouse-Blagnac Airport, southern France, early morning, a massive white aircraft freshly painted and gleaming sitting at the end of runway 32 left, thousands of Airbus employees lining the perimeter, cameras from every major news organization in the world pointed at it. The four Rolls-Royce Trent 970 engines spool up with a sound that is less a roar and more a deep, resonant pressure you feel in your chest. Then the aircraft begins to move, accelerating down the runway with a speed that seems impossible for something this size. It rotates at 150 knots and lifts cleanly into the blue sky over the Pyrenees. And for 3 hours and 54 minutes, the entire aviation world holds its breath. It works. Despite everything, the cost overruns, the political battles, the engineering compromises, the sheer audacity of the attempt. It works. The aircraft is stable, quiet, responsive, and beautiful. Airbus chief test pilot Jacques Rosé lands it back at Toulouse and tells the waiting crowd that flying the A380 was like handling a bicycle. The crowd goes insane. For one perfect morning in April 2005, Airbus had built the future. But the future has a way of being more complicated than a single perfect morning. By 2008, the wiring crisis had been resolved, deliveries had begun, and the A380 was entering service with Singapore Airlines on the route from Singapore to Sydney. The interior of the upper deck cabin was bathed in soft lighting, passengers settling into seats noticeably wider and quieter than anything they had experienced before, flight attendants moving through aisles that felt more like a hotel corridor than an aircraft. And then Emirates stepped in. Tim Clark, the president of Emirates, had been obsessed with the A380 since before it existed. He had lobbied Airbus to build it. He had placed orders early. And when the program was teetering on the edge of cancellation in 2008, when airlines were quietly reconsidering their commitments and the order book was looking dangerously thin, Emirates placed an order for 32 additional aircraft. Then more. Then more again. Emirates would eventually order 123 A380s, accounting for nearly half of all aircraft ever delivered. And without that single airline's extraordinary commitment, the program would have died before most people ever got to fly on one. One airline, one man's vision. Keeping the most ambitious commercial aircraft program in history alive through sheer force of belief. And passengers, the people who actually sat in those seats, they loved it. They genuinely, overwhelmingly, consistently loved it. The quiet was the first thing everyone mentioned. The A380 was the quietest large airliner ever built. Its four engines and its massive airframe absorbing vibration in a way that made the cabin feel almost surreally calm at cruise altitude. Passengers describing it as the first time they had ever felt genuinely relaxed on a long-haul flight. The space was the second thing. Wider seats, wider aisles, lower cabin altitude, better pressurization, arriving at destinations feeling less destroyed than on any comparable aircraft. And then there was the Emirates experience specifically, a real bar on the upper deck, passengers in economy standing up mid-flight to order a drink and talk to strangers, first-class suites with closing doors and personal minibars, and at the very front of the upper deck, available to first-class passengers on certain routes, actual shower suites, a private cubicle with running hot water at 40,000 feet, 5 minutes of water per booking, the most absurd and wonderful luxury ever offered on a commercial aircraft. A passenger stepping out of a shower cubicle wrapped in a towel while outside the window, the Atlantic Ocean stretches to the horizon 38,000 feet below. Passengers loved it. Airlines, it turned out, had a more complicated relationship with it. The cracks began appearing quietly, the way structural problems always do. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a series of small decisions that individually seemed reasonable and collectively told a story. Airlines began returning their A380s earlier than expected. Not because the aircraft was unreliable. It was extraordinarily reliable, but because the economics were shifting underneath it. The hub-and-spoke model that the A380 had been designed to serve was not evolving the way Airbus had predicted. Hub airports were not becoming more congested in the way the models had suggested. New runways were being built. Air traffic management was improving. And crucially, the airlines that had ordered A380s were discovering that filling 550 seats on every flight, on every route, consistently enough to make the economics work, was harder than the spreadsheets had suggested. An aircraft that size needs to be full to be profitable, and keeping it full requires a route network and a passenger volume that only a handful of airlines in the world actually possess. Then the Boeing 787 arrived. Then the Airbus A350. Smaller aircraft, twin engines instead of four, dramatically lower fuel burn per seat. The ability to open new point-to-point routes that bypassed the congested hubs entirely. Exactly what Boeing had predicted in 2000. Exactly the model that Airbus had bet against. A sleek twin-engine 787 banking over a mountain range, its carbon fiber fuselage catching the light. Its two engines burning roughly 40% less fuel per seat than the A380's four. Airlines that had ordered A380s began looking at their route networks and doing the math. The math was not kind. Qantas began retiring its A380s. Air France announced it would not return its fleet to service after the pandemic grounding. Singapore Airlines, the launch customer, the airline that had put the A380 into service on that first flight from Singapore to Sydney, began quietly reducing its fleet. The dominoes were falling one by one, with a terrible inevitability, and everyone in the industry could see where they were going. January 14th, 2019. Airbus headquarters in Toulouse. A press conference that the aviation world had been dreading for months. Airbus CEO Tom Enders stands at a podium and announces that production of the A380 will end in 2021. The final aircraft, the 251st, will be delivered to Emirates. The program is over. The reaction from the industry is described in every report as shock, but it is the shock of confirmation, not surprise. Everyone knew. The numbers had been telling the story for years. 251 aircraft were delivered against an original break-even estimate of 420. A development cost that will never be recouped. A vision of the future that the future declined to inhabit. Airbus engineers who had given decades of their careers to the program watched the announcement on screens in offices across 5 countries. Some of them in tears, all of them knowing that what they had built was extraordinary, and that extraordinary had not been enough. But here is where the story refuses to end cleanly, because Emirates is still flying them. In 2024, Emirates is still operating over 100 A380s, still investing in cabin refurbishments, still fitting new interiors, still treating the aircraft as the centerpiece of its long-haul network. Tim Clark, the man who saved the program in 2008, has never wavered. Emirates passengers consistently rate the A380 as their preferred aircraft. The load factors on Emirates A380 routes are among the highest in the airline's network. The aircraft that the market rejected is, on the routes it was designed to fly, operated by the airline that understood it best, still performing exactly as Airbus always said it would. The paradox at the heart of the A380 story is that it was not a failed aircraft. It was an aircraft that found exactly one customer who truly understood it, and that customer was not enough to sustain a production line. And the legacy, the physical, concrete, permanent legacy, is written into the infrastructure of global aviation in ways that will outlast every aircraft currently flying. 130 airports around the world reinforced their runways for the A380. They built dual-level jet bridges. They widened taxiways. They redesigned gate areas. They spent billions of dollars preparing for an aircraft that, in many cases, they would see only a handful of times before it was retired. The boarding technology developed for the A380, the systems for simultaneously loading passengers on 2 decks, the ground handling procedures, the emergency evacuation protocols, all of it became standard practice across the industry. The composite wing manufacturing techniques pioneered for the A380 fed directly into the A350 program. The noise reduction technology influenced every large aircraft that came after it. The A380 did not conquer the market, but it permanently changed the infrastructure, the technology, and the engineering standards of global aviation. It left fingerprints on everything. So was it a masterpiece or a mistake? The honest answer is that it was both, simultaneously, inseparably, and that is precisely what makes it one of the greatest stories in the history of human engineering. It was a masterpiece of design, of manufacturing, of passenger experience, of sheer audacious ambition. It was a mistake of market timing, of strategic forecasting, of financial discipline, of reading an industry that was moving in a direction nobody fully understood. It was built by people who genuinely believed they were building the future, and they were right about the aircraft and wrong about the world. And the gap between those two things cost $25 billion and 2 decades and the careers of people who deserved better. The A380 never conquered the skies the way Airbus dreamed, but it conquered something else. The hearts of everyone who ever flew on one, everyone who ever stood at a perimeter fence and watched it pass overhead, everyone who ever sat at a bar at 40,000 feet and thought, this is what flying was always supposed to feel like. If you want more stories about the machines that defined an era, the gambles that shaped industries, and the moments where human ambition collided with reality at 500 miles an hour, subscribe. There is a lot more to come.